Hello, everybody. Welcome to another one of our comparative economics webinars. We are absolutely delighted today to have Professor Barry Eichengreen presenting. Before briefly introducing him, let me just go over the basic housing rules of the seminar. If you have any clarification questions, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions, and halfway through presentation, we'll collect them and present them to Barry so that he can react. And if you have more fundamental questions, please raise your hand at the end and we will mute you after the presentation. We're going to have about 20 minutes, 20 minutes Q&A session at the end. Again, Barry, it's a huge pleasure to have you here today. Barry Eichengreen is the George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. And we're delighted to have you here today presenting a paper on the political scar of epidemics. Barry, thank you so much for accepting our invite. The floor is yours.
Noro, thank you. And thank you both for the initiative for putting this webinar series together. The pandemic changes everything. That's the theme of one of my slides about to come. But I think among other things, it is reinvigorating comparative economics, given that a lot of the research questions that people are asking compare effects and policy responses across countries and societies. So off we go. I should emphasize as we begin that this is joint work with Shevet Aksoy and Orkan Saka, I think both of whom will be part of the Q&A portion as we go forward. This is the COVID-19 changes everything slide. Among other things, it changes people's research agendas. So this paper is something of a new departure for the three of us. It builds off of some work that we had begun previously, but it is, in an obvious sense, a response to the pandemic. Among the things the pandemic could conceivably change, does plausibly change, is how people feel about government, how they feel about their governmental institutions, how they feel about the integrity of elections, how they feel about the competence of political leaders. So the paper is specifically concerned with how the pandemic, how epidemics more broadly affect the confidence or trust that people place in political institutions and leaders. We know from observation, and because many people have told us, have reminded us, that trust in government, trust and confidence in government and leaders is important for the capacity of a country and a society to mount an effective response to the COVID epidemic. Frank Fukuyama put it this way, that the key to success is whether, quote, citizens trust their leaders and whether those leaders preside over a competent and effective state. Bloomberg has told us this, that the secret to coronavirus success is trust in government, in the subheadline, trust in leaders, implicit in the photograph you see here. But trust in government and leaders is not a given. It in turn can be affected by the epidemic and its effects. And there I think we know much less. We know less about how COVID will affect trust in government and leaders. Indeed, we don't even know the sign of the effect a priori. So there is a rally around the flag hypothesis that suggests a positive effect. And then there is anger or alienation, possibly stemming from the failure of containment, which would suggest a negative effect rather than a positive one. So I was emailing with a Swedish colleague yesterday who unprompted by me, suggested that there had been a positive rally round the flag effect in Sweden initially, but that effect had turned negative with the failure of some early predictions about spread to be validated, and in response to the failure of containment. Moreover, we don't know whether those effects, whatever their sign is, will be transitory or persistent, whether this will be a short-lived impact on how people feel about their governments and leaders, or a more persistent one. And that obviously matters for the importance of any effect one might detect. Again, one finds in popular discourse discussions of both possible responses. So the Edelman Trust has done a survey of people in a variety of countries, suggesting that the pandemic has increased trust in government. But we also hear the opposite here from the New York Times about the response in the United States. Will the coronavirus kill what's left of Americans' faith in Washington? A priori, we simply don't know which effect is likely to dominate. So that's was our motivation for this research. In the paper, which you can find online, we present the first systematic evidence, we believe, of an enduring effect. We show that experiencing an epidemic causes individuals to place less trust and confidence in their government and leaders. And we suggest that this finding of a negative effect is troubling because it points to the possibility of a vicious spiral in which lack of trust in government allows an epidemic to spread, and the spread of the epidemic further erodes trust in government. So as I said, we started this project after the start of the pandemic. We also started it before the current wave of anti-government, anti-police protests in a variety of countries. We don't show this directly, but I would suggest that there's a connection between the failure of certain governments to mount an effective response to the pandemic on the one hand, and what we now see going on in the streets on the other. Specifically, in more detail, we find the following: that there is an impact on trust and confidence in government if individuals experienced an epidemic in their impressionable years, the years that psychologists and sociologists emphasize when people's views are durably formed, the late teen and early adult years spanning the ages 18 through 25. If people experienced an epidemic in their country when they were of that age, those are the individuals whose opinions are affected. The effects are large. High exposure, which I will define in a moment, is associated with a 5 percentage point decline in confidence in government. So if 50% of respondents in our data set say that they're confident in, trust their government or have confidence in their leaders, that 50% declines to 45%. Other things equal if the population is exposed seriously to an epidemic. The effects are persistent, so that's an important finding. The scar of the epidemic is visible for fully 2 decades of life of the individuals in question. The effects are limited to, they are specific to communicable diseases, such as viruses, for which timely and effective public policy response is especially important. The same result obtains for confidence in the public health system. We look at a separate survey where people are asked about whether they are confident in the public health system. in medical professionals, in vaccination, which suggests that the effect is specifically health or health system related. The effect is largest when individuals experience epidemics under weak governments being least able to effectively respond to an epidemic. And we document that last point directly, that weak governments do take longer in putting in place the non-pharmaceutical interventions that are important in limiting the spread of a virus. And the effect is driven, interestingly, by individuals in democratic political systems and societies. And I think the logic there is that people expect democracies to be responsive to their health needs and other needs. When they're disappointed, they revise their expectations about the competence of those governments in a negative direction. In autocracies, they may not come into the situation with the same expectation of responsiveness, so they don't revise their beliefs and expectations in the same way. We, as I said, emphasize epidemic experience in individuals in survey respondents' impressionable years. This impressionable years hypothesis has appeared in the literature of economics and related literatures before. So Giuliano and Spilimbergo in a well-known 2014 Ari Stud article showed that experiencing a recession when one is in one's impressionable years of 18 to 25 has a significant impact on beliefs about the economy and economic behavior more broadly. There are other studies that have shown that experiencing political repression during one's impressionable years causes individuals to withhold their opinions in surveys compared to otherwise comparable individuals who grew up in less repressive times. That Germans in their impressionable years during the Nazi expulsion of Jews are less interested and involved in politics later in life compared to the less exposed. So this impressionable years hypothesis has been employed elsewhere. It originates in a panel survey of women who attended Bennington College in the US in the 1930s and who were surveyed repeatedly through life by Alexander Newcomb and associates who documented the extent to which views formed when these women were between the ages of 18 and 25 durably shaped their views and behavior later in life. And this hypothesis has been linked to Karl Mannheim's much earlier concept of the fresh encounter, that views are durably formed when late adolescents and adults encounter new ideas or events for the first time. It's been linked to the psychologist Erik Erikson's theory of identity, that individuals at this age are especially open to new influences because they're at the stage of life where they're forming their sense of self and identity. More recently, it's been linked to work in neurology, which describes neurochemical and anatomical differences between the adolescent and adult brain, and suggests that those changes in the adult brain are associated with durable attitude formation. So I should emphasize at this point what we will tell you again several times. We test for comparable effects of epidemic exposure for younger people. If people experience an epidemic in their country when they're younger than the age of 18. And we test for the effects of epidemic exposure when people are older, over the age of 25, when the event occurs. And we do not find the same effect for those younger and older individuals. So this does confirm in a different setting from before the importance of the impressionable year hypothesis. I've been speaking about confidence and trust interchangeably because this is a relatively short talk in the paper, and in the talk, we attach the umbrella label political trust to both of the above. Confidence, my dictionary tells me, is the belief that certain future outcomes will obtain. Trust means vesting confidence in specific institutions or individuals. And interestingly, that's how the public health literature, people who've looked specifically at confidence or trust in public health officials and health system institutions, have used the term. So confidence and trust are slightly different, but the shortness of the talk doesn't really enable me to draw those distinctions as systematically as I would like. Here are the data that we use. We use the Gallup World Polls, which have the advantage that they are administered in a large number, 142 different countries, and they are administered at a variety of different times. So we're able to capture people in the same country who may have or have not experienced an epidemic in their impressionable years. We are able to capture people of the same age who may or may not have experienced an epidemic because they are in different countries. And we, as our dependent variables, analyze responses to these three questions. In your country, do you have confidence in each of the following or not? In the national government, in the honesty of elections, do you approve or disapprove of the job performance of the leadership of this country? And we know a good deal about the other characteristics of the individual respondents. We know not only how old they are, but a bunch of other demographic characteristics which we employ as controls. Their labor market status, are you employed, unemployed, out of the labor force, their income as well. The income is useful because we want to be sure that we're not picking up simply the economic scar of the epidemic, that maybe people's incomes are lower because of the current or lingering impact on the economy of the epidemic. Here are how the data look. I'm reminded that people in my country are less confident in the integrity of elections than our neighbors to the north. In Canada, there is some interesting variation in these data, as there is in average confidence in government more generally. I'm tempted to go back and say there's a look at Russia, very imperfect correlation between these two measures. And we then link up the Gallup World Polls to an EMDAT international disaster database, where we extract from that database 47 epidemics and pandemics since 1970, affecting 137 countries. So a given epidemic can show up in several countries depending on whether or not an individual country satisfies one or more of the four criteria listed at the top of this slide. 10 or more fatalities as a result of the epidemic, 100 or more people affected requiring significant medical assistance, declaration of a state of emergency by the government, or an international call, a call for international assistance. When we measure the severity of the epidemic, so we try to look at not only whether a country is coded as having experienced an epidemic, but also at severity. We look at the total number of individuals requiring immediate assistance during the period of emergency. And we merged these data then with Gallup World Polls data that I described to you before. We supplement that data set with data from a variety of other sources. So as I said before, we distinguish communicable and non-communicable diseases using data from the Institute for Health Metrics. We use data from the Wellcome Global Monitor on attitude toward vaccines and health systems. We look at the strength or weakness of government by constructing a variable from the International Country Risk Guide. And we use data from Google Trends, the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, the Oxford Government Response Tracker to look at how quickly or slowly governments of different types have responded to the current pandemic. And this is what our data from EMDAT on epidemic intensity look like, just kind of a crude average over the 40 plus years that for which we have data. So you can see this confirms what you probably already suspected, that it's in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Latin America where there is the highest frequency. But an important point is that we have at least some information on epidemics, as I just defined, for a very large number of other countries as well, although intensity varies. So again, what we do in order to associate exposure with an individual survey respondent is we line up that epidemic exposure with the years the individual in question was in his or her impressionable years. So if a respondent to the survey, if we have survey respondents for an individual who was 26 years old at the time of the survey, we look at that individual's impressionable years in particular, and depending on the years in question, we cycle through different calendar years for that individual, depending on when the epidemic effect was observed. So the treatment effect sums the different years in which that individual's age coincides with the epidemic in question. The basic specification we use is the survey response. Do you have confidence in your government? Yes or no, as a function of how much exposure the individual had to the epidemic in his or her formative years, where we control for the severity of the epidemic, as I described before. We have a variety of other individual, demographic, and economic controls. And we control as well for country fixed effects. So we're filtering out all differences across countries that are time invariant, of course. We're controlling for year fixed effects, so our results are not driven by other factors that are calendar year specific. We control for cohort fixed effects. Our effects are not driven by differences across cohorts, given that epidemics are not randomly distributed across cohorts. We're controlling for age effects as well. And we're controlling for country-specific age trends, that as people get older, maybe they grow more skeptical about their governments at different rates in different countries. So I think I've just eliminated several dozen questions from the Q&A part about, aren't your results driven by differences across countries, differences across years, differences across cohorts, differences across age groups, different country-specific age trends? And the answer is no, they're not. That's kind of the delight of having a very large, rich panel data set. So we've ruled out all of the above, as I just said, and we rule out political risk factors as well by including the country risk score that I described to you briefly a moment ago. So I'm going to skip over this table quickly because it's too small to be, the entries are too small to be visible, but this is to give you a flavor of what the many tables in the paper look like, where each column shows a different dependent variable, and the key coefficients are on whether the individual was exposed to an epidemic in his or her impressionable years. That's the top row, and you can see the negative coefficients, a negative effect on confidence in government, elections, leaders. You can see the negative effect, the negative coefficient on the severity of the epidemic, and then a variety of different fixed effects as we move across columns. So this is a somewhat more visible summary table where each entry is a different regression with now the different dependent variables visible. And you can see the key coefficient on whether or not the individual was exposed to an epidemic in his or her impressionable years. He or she may still be in that age group, or he or she may be much older at the time of the survey. And you can see that almost without exception, the coefficients are significantly different than 0. I'll show you in a moment that they're large, they're consistently negative. And that table I showed you 2 slides back was the basis for the calculation that an individual with the highest score, where 3% of the population was directly affected in distress as a result of the epidemic, is 7 percentage points less confident in the honesty of elections, for example, than an individual not otherwise the same, but not equally affected. The effects are persistent. So these are, 8-year-long age groups or cohorts. So this is the effect of past epidemic exposure as we roll the age group that we're looking at, the respondents that we're looking at, 1 year forward, 1 year at a time. If we roll them forward by 10 years, and this is an 8-year-long cohort, we're basically looking 10 years on at somebody who's 18 years older than initially, and they still are significantly less likely to have approved the leader in this figure, but the figures for confidence in government, confidence in the integrity of elections are exactly the same. So the effect of this exposure is persistent. It lasts for fully 2 decades. Here we do the same experiments that I described to you before, the same analysis, but we imagine that, or we look at epidemic exposure for people who are not 18 to 25 years old, the 3rd row, but rather 10 to 17 years old, or 2 to 9 years old, or 26 to 33 years old. So these are 8-year wide cohorts of individuals. And to my mind, this is pretty strong evidence that the impressionable years are impressionable. They are different. If that's when you were exposed, if that's when you were treated by epidemic exposure, that has a significant effect that is not visible on the part of other, if you were treated when you were younger or when you were older. So if you didn't believe in the impressionable years hypothesis before, you should believe it now. The effects, there are lots of further results in the paper, and in the interest of time, I will skip over them relatively quickly. The effects are larger when an individual lives in a country with a weak government. Weak governments presumably less able to mount an effective response. We know directly from COVID-19 that we're looking across 40 to 80 different countries, and how long it took them to respond to the first case with a non-pharmaceutical intervention, with a distancing or lockdown order. And this is informal, but I think pretty convincing documentation that weak governments took longer to respond, even when you control for other country characteristics and continent fixed effects and so forth and so on. Effects are the effects that our main effects in the paper, it turns out, are driven mainly by residents of democratic countries, which I said before are supposed to be responsive to their citizens, and when they're not responsive in an effective manner, those citizens are apt to be disappointed. So here's the weak government effect, the same effects that I showed you before here, approval of the leader, but it doesn't really matter which dependent variable we look like in the top, only for residents of countries with weak governments. Effects are larger and more persistent than they are in the case of residents of stronger governments. Driven by democracies, there are lots of additional results in the paper. We look at differences between men and women. I leave it to the audience to speculate about why women respond more strongly than men in the event of epidemic exposure. We look at low-income countries and higher-income countries. The effects are there for both. So that's something relevant for external validity. It's not all about sub-Saharan Africa, but the effects are stronger in low-income countries. And I incidentally saw a new CPR Vox EU ebook about the crisis in low-income countries, and there was independent evidence there that the effects on trust in government are stronger in low-income countries. The effects vary with degree of education, and I leave it to you to speculate about why. The effects are stronger among urban residents, where presumably the risk of infection is even greater, but they're driven entirely by the residents of democracies, which is striking, could be explained for the reason I described before, could also be explained conceivably, I think, by the greater difficulty that democratic governments have in consistent messaging, that there are a variety of different officials saying different things. If you live in an autocracy, you follow the leader in terms of what the message is. If you live in the United States, you hear President Trump say less testing, but you heard Anthony Fauci yesterday say, no, more testing, which may affect the trust of residents and citizens. The effect is specific to communicable diseases. So here we break out exposure to communicable diseases and exposure to non-communicable diseases when the individual is or was in his or her impressionable years. Again, specific to democracies, but also specific, interestingly, to communicable diseases, which I think, again, makes sense. There is a lot of robustness analysis, and so that we can go to the Q&A, I'll simply summarize what we do rather than show you what we do. There are different data sets for when and where epidemics occurred, and we employed those different data sets. There are different ways that you could measure the severity of an epidemic, and we employ those different measures. One can control for a variety of different countrywide economic conditions like GDP growth, per capita income, inflation, and we control for those. One could control for current epidemic exposure as well as past epidemic exposure. We do that. And one can look at the effect of epidemic exposure, look for an effect of epidemic exposure on other governmental institutions and leaders. We think of this as kind of placebo tests. We look at whether there's an impact on confidence in the military. There is not. Confidence in banks and other financial institutions. There is not. Confidence in the media. There is not. So the effect is fairly specific to the institutions that we look at, with one exception, health-related outcomes. So looking at a different data set, we do find an impact on negative impact on confidence in public health systems of epidemic exposure during the impressionable years, a negative impact on the belief that vaccines are effective, a negative impact on belief that vaccines are safe, a negative impact on belief that vaccines are important for children. So those are the four questions relevant to us that the Wellcome Trust has asked. So it's interesting that there seems to be a link between epidemic exposure, confidence in public health systems, and confidence in government elections and political leaders specifically. So there is more in the paper, but I'll conclude on that point. The key takeaways are that past epidemic experience during an individual's impressionable years negatively affects his or her political trust for a long period thereafter. The effect seems to be driven by the government's response or lack thereof to the epidemic. The effect is magnified under weak governments, and the effect is specific to democracies. I've been reading a lot about how Americans are evaluating Donald Trump and the US government's response to the pandemic. Been reading about how UK residents have been evaluating Boris Johnson and the British government's response. I think those responses can be made sense of by the more general results that we find in the paper. So I thank everybody for the attention. My co-authors are on the webinar, and I hope they will chime in now as we move to the Q&A. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Barry, for this wonderful presentation and wonderful paper. In fact, we got a couple of questions. So we would start with Jan Fiedermuth. Jan, you had a couple of questions. I will unmute you now, just to check if they are all clarified. We can hear you.
Yeah, I think this has been largely answered by Orkun, but essentially my concern was about the definition of epidemic, which is essentially given threshold, the same threshold is applied to all countries. And so, say one of them is 10 deaths, and a large country would, with the same exposure to an epidemic, a large country would meet this threshold more easily than a relatively small country. And the other issue was, I was wondering whether 18 to 25 years doesn't place the band for impressionable years at too high an age. I would kind of assume that basically teenagers younger than 18 would also be quite impressionable, but you essentially referred to these issues already in your presentation. So thanks.
We get interesting reactions to the impressionable years part of the paper. Some people, introspection tells them that, yes, I did form my political affiliation and my views of a variety of things when I was in college, at university, in my late teen and early adult years. And other people say, no, I formed those views earlier. We should be looking at teenagers. But the data do speak to the issue, and they speak pretty loudly. Orkun, do you want to elaborate what you said before about country size?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I think it's a good concern that there might be a bit of sorting in terms of how the pandemics are defined, because as Jan rightly emphasized, it's the case that, for instance, some countries, smaller countries, may not be able to attain that threshold of 10 deaths. But in terms of having a threshold, I think this could go as low as I guess you can, but one can still look at if there is any other or historically if there are any other epidemic or pandemic episodes where where the numbers were even lower than that. But it's not really much of a concern, I think, in our setting, because I will just relate this question to the question that Elodie asked, I think, in the chat, where she said, would it be better to use rather than using the intensity, which is what we are doing right now, she asked whether it would be better to use a dummy variable, just like being exposed or not. And we actually have done that. And when we do that, we see that 55% of the people in our sample actually don't have any epidemic exposure at all during their impressionable years, right? So they're just zero, right? The continuous measure is just zero. When we do put just a dummy for the 45%, which had somewhat an exposure, and then just compare the 55 to 45%, just like a simple 1 and 0 dummy, there doesn't seem to be much of an effect. So the effect is not coming from simply being exposed to any epidemic, but it's coming more from the intensive margin, in the sense that only the large epidemics really affecting a bigger portion of the population in that country are leading to these negative outcomes. And we have also shown those in the paper. So intensity matters in that case, in that sense.
Well, that would also make sense. I was actually wondering whether 10 deaths in a year is really a relevant threshold. I guess most countries would have more than that, just because of a seasonal flu. I am currently in a country where we've had, depending on which estimates you take, anywhere between 45 to 70 or 80,000 deaths this year so far. So 10 deaths would have been a wonderful outcome for this epidemic, obviously.
True. So, I mean, with this kind of a definition, I don't think we are missing many episodes or really important episodes in our treatment variable.
And as Orkun said, we look at the extensive margin and the intensive margin, and it's really the extensive margin, the big epidemics that drive the results.
Okay.
Okay, great. Elodie, I would also allow you to talk now if you have a clarification question of what Orkun just said. Now we can hear you if you unmute yourself.
Okay, hi.
Hello, yes.
Hello. So I think I actually misunderstood the presentation. So Orkun's clarification was very useful. I understood actually that in the paper you had used the dummy. and not the intensity. So you know, the clarification was very useful. I'm just going to take advantage of the fact that I have the mic to ask another question. So when you were talking about COVID specifically, you made a point that, you know, how government responded mattered. But in your analysis, how are you controlling for how government responded? Do we have any information about whether they did anything right or wrong? Because it seems that it would matter.
We have data on fatalities. Beyond that, there is not, to my knowledge, historical data set spanning countries on pharmaceutical or non-pharmaceutical interventions, which I think is what you're asking about. We know something about the response insofar as it affects the economy, because we have those macroeconomic controls and individual economic controls. But non-pharmaceutical interventions, boy, would that be nice to have.
All right.
Just to add something. So Elodie, I think it's a very relevant question, and this is exactly why we are trying to test this mechanism in the context of COVID-19. It's exactly because we cannot really see what is driving the effect behind the strength of the government, and we are thinking that, you know, our hypothesis is that as the government is more strong, they are going to be able to deliver better policies at the time of the epidemic. But as Barry just stated, there is no historical data set in terms of, you know, we cannot see how governments really responded in terms of policymaking during these episodes. So what we do is we try to, because we have very recent data with the COVID setting, we try to validate this mechanism by using this recent setting, and we show that actually, yes, this is a predictor of effective policy. So the reason that you're seeing this extra effects when the epidemics are experienced with the weak governments in charge must be because of the, let's say, less effective policies that they must have produced. So it's a prediction basically, and a validation from the COVID setting.
It makes me recall that we have data on these non-pharmaceutical interventions, for example, across cities for the 1918-1919 Spanish flu pandemic in the United States, and I think for Spanish regions and so forth. It would be interesting to look at electoral behavior, for example, in the wake of that experience.
Indeed. Thank you very much. So, super interesting presentation, and thanks a lot for the clarification.
Okay, perfect. Then Simon Selström also had a question. Orkun, you also already answered them, but I'm just checking if there is a follow-up. Simon, if you unmute yourself, then we can hear you.
Yes. Well,
Perfect.
I think the answer was good. So, but I mean, I believe there's more nuance to the question of government strength. But I actually got another question inspired by the previous person, and well, I was just thinking that it's hard to disentangle the effect of the epidemic itself and the government response. And I think you talked about this, but I guess the question is it possible to separate the effect of the government's response and the epidemic itself? Because I imagine that people are just associating the high numbers of death with, well, I guess that people find, people believe that the government, or seem to believe that the government is to blame for all of these deaths, or that could be one mechanism that is driving sort of the results. And I suspect that it's hard for you to really know if it's just the epidemic itself that people are angry or just being disappointed on, or if it's the government strength itself.
Well, so first of all, it's good to see you, Seaman, even if you have your camera see a theme in the comments. Again, it's hard to pin down the link with 100% confidence in the absence of survey questions that ask people about the government's response to an epidemic. Wouldn't be an appropriate question to ask in non-epidemic times, presumably, so it's not asked. I showed you a slide at the beginning of the presentation from the Edelman Trust where they are now asking questions related to that. So it may be that as we go forward in time, we're going to be able to analyze those data as well.
I can add something maybe. So I think there's a case to be made for both types of effects, in the sense that if maybe Barry, I'm not sure if Barry is still sharing his screen, but in the persistency graphs that we have documented in the paper, when you separate the effects as under weak governments and under, let's say, relatively stronger governments, there are still effects on both sides. But the difference is that the effect is much more persistent when the epidemic is experienced with the weak government. So it seems that there might be an overall effect, whether even when the government responds as best as they can, the people can interpret the disaster itself as a failure in the government policymaking. But when the government is actually weak and we're thinking that this mechanism is leading to worse policymaking, then actually this kind of an effect is magnified or almost doubles and also becomes much more persistent. So I think there's a case to be made for both types of channels.
Okay, great. Thank you, Orkun and Barry. And then I will allow Jan to speak again. You have another question?
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering, so in the UK and also in the US, there are important political effects or political affiliation effects in the sense that in the UK, if you read The Guardian, which is kind of pro-Labour, they're very critical of the government. If you read more pro-Tory newspapers, they are much less critical and so on. Could you look at something like this in your data? Essentially, you could find out what government was in office at the time of the epidemic. And then I guess the World Value Survey has information about political preferences of the respondents. So you could essentially see whether they prefer a similar kind of parties or policies, or indeed the same party if the same party is still present in that country. It would, I guess, involve a lot of work, but it could be a kind of possibly interesting to see whether these kind of political affiliation effects are present also with respect to previous epidemics. And a second question, the EMDA database also has incidents of natural disasters and industrial disasters. Are people responding similarly to deaths and casualties or damages due to essentially acts of God, and then which would be natural disasters, and then man-made disasters, industrial disasters, or is it just epidemics? Thanks.
So I believe the accurate answer to both questions is the same. These hypotheses or questions have occurred to us and we haven't analyzed them yet. I don't think that my co-authors will correct me that we have party affiliation coded in a way we can use it in the Gallup World polls, but
Gallup doesn't ask about party affiliation or left-right political spectrum.
Okay.
But we could potentially do that with World Value Survey or European Social Survey. The caveat is, of course, if you use European Social Survey, there's much fewer epidemics happening in Europe, of course. But something we can look at. World Value Survey is something actually we can look at.
And the natural disasters thing is an interesting check that, or we'll add it to the list, which is already very long.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Are there any further questions? Just raise your hand. If not, then I think Nauro, you have another question.
Yeah, I have a quick one. Thank you very much for the very nice presentation. I suspect the presentation jumps from table 3 to table 9. So I'm sure you have these results. I'm just going to ask if you can summarize them, because you're looking basically at trust in government and trust in elections. But for the sake of argument, we can imagine that this trusted government in this question is quite broad and refers basically to the executive. For the case of pandemics, we can imagine that trust in the civil service or trust in local authorities could be more important. I imagine you have this variable in tables 4 to 9 or 4 to 8. Then if you could say something along those lines, you did talk about military, banks, and media, but nothing on the bureaucracy and civil services. So that I'm just wondering how the results came out.
So I don't recall that we have information on civil service or local government, which would be very, very nice to be able to analyze. But I don't think that was part of Gallup World Polls.
Barry's right. There's no question or there's no variable in Gallup World Poll that will allow us to investigate reactions to or satisfaction with local governments or satisfaction or dissatisfaction with bureaucratic system or civil service.
That's great.
Okay, perfect. I don't see any further questions. If there are, just raise your hands. Otherwise,
yes, I think we can stop recording, I guess. We should thank everybody. Thank Barry in particular for the superb presentation. Thanks to Servat and Okun for handling all the questions too. Thanks